Hello and welcome back to my favorite wonderful book, COVID-19, The Great Reset by Klaus Schwab and Thierry Malloret of Forum Publishing, supposedly published in June of 2020. Continuing on the bottom of page 206, because I broke the mic earlier. One moment, please, for the reading shall continue. I will give you a chance to be seated, to grab a coffee or tea, a beverage of any kind, a libation. Wow. So that princess I need to save. Okay. Okay, sounds good. And how's all the fans and stuff? It's all right? It's all right? I got a smoke in here. Cigs. I didn't make that. I just glued it on my hat. And then while I was reading, the book ripped it off. Welcome back, everyone. Page 206 at the bottom. Let's do this without any judgment. Let's be like water. Well, it's going to be hard, but add your comments in for me instead. You do it. The collective quest for, we are starting to read now, my favorite book. The collective quest for resilience also favors the sports industry, closely related to well-being, as it is now well understood that physical activity greatly contributes to health. Sport will be increasingly recognized as a low-cost tool for a healthier society. Therefore, governments will encourage their practice, acknowledging the added benefit that sports constitute one of the best tools available for inclusivity and social integration. For a while, social distancing may constrain the practice of certain sports, which will in turn benefit the ever more powerful expansion of esports. Tech and digital are never far away. Four industries that have been grappling with a host of particular challenges posed by the pandemic crisis illustrate the diverse nature of resilience. In banking, it is about being prepared for the digital transformation. In insurance, it is about being prepared for the litigations that are coming. In automotive, it is about being prepared for the coming shortening of supply chains. In the electricity sector, it is about being prepared for the inevitable energy transition. The challenges are the same within each industry, and only the most resilient and better prepared companies within each will be capable of, quote, engineering a successful outcome. Because of the nature of their activity, when an economic crisis happens, banks tend to find themselves in the epicenter of the storm. With CO Video 19, the risk doubled in intensity. First, banks have to prepare for the possibility that the consumer liquidity crisis morphs into a major corporate solvency crisis, in which case their resilience will be severely tested. Second, they have to adjust to the way in which the pandemic is challenging traditional banking habits, a different form of resilience that requires further capacities of adaptation. The first risk, the first risk to the category of traditional, quote, financial risks for which banks have had years to prepare. It is being dealt with through capital and liquidity buffers that have to be robust enough to withstand a major shock. In the case of CO Video 19 crisis, the test of resilience will come when the volume of non performing loans starts rising. The situation is entirely different for the second category of risks. Almost overnight, retail, Commercial and investment banks were faced with an often unexpected situation of having to move online. The impossibility to meet colleagues, clients, or fellow traders in person, the necessity to use contactless payment, and the exhortation from regulators to use online banking and online trading in conditions of remote working all meant that the entire banking industry had to move towards digital banking at the stroke of a pen. CO Video 19 has forced all the banks to accelerate a digital transformation that is now here to stay. And that has intensified cybersecurity risks, which could in turn raise systemic stability implications if they are not properly mitigated. Those that have lagged behind and missed the high speed digital train will find it very hard to adapt and to survive. In the insurance industry, many different COVID 19 related claims have been made under various types of household and commercial insurance, which include commercial property and business interruption, travel, life, health, and liability, like workers' compensation and employment practices liability. The pandemic poses a particular risk to the insurance industry because its existence and functioning are based upon the principle of risk diversification, which was effectively suppressed when governments decided to impose a lockdown. For this reason, hundreds of thousands of businesses around the world have been unable to successfully file claims and are either facing months, if not years, of litigation or ruin. In May 2020, the insurance industry estimated that the pandemic could potentially cost more than $200 billion, making it one of the most expensive events in the history of the insurance industry. The cost will rise if the lockdowns go beyond the period under consideration when the forecast was made. For the insurance industry, the post COVID 19 challenge consists in meeting the evolving protection needs of its customers by building greater resilience to a broad range of potentially uninsurable catastrophic shocks like pandemics, extreme weather events, cyber attacks, and terrorism. It has to do so while navigating an environment of exceedingly low interest rates, while preparing for anticipated litigation and the possibility of unprecedented claims and losses. In the last few years, the automotive industry has been engulfed in a rising storm of challenges, ranging from trade and geopolitical uncertainty, declining sales and CO2 penalties, to fast changing customer demand and the multifaceted nature of the rising competition in mobility, electric vehicles, autonomous cars, shared mobility. The pandemic has exacerbated these challenges by adding to the considerable uncertainty the industry is facing. In particular, with respect to supply chains, in the early stages of the outbreak, the shortage of Chinese components had a detrimental impact on global automotive production. In coming months and years, the industry will have to rethink its whole organization and ways of operating against the backdrop of reduced supply chains and a likely drop in vehicle sales. Throughout the successive stages of the pandemic, and in particular during the lockdowns, the electricity sector played an essential role in allowing most of the world to carry on digitally, the hospitals to run, and all essential industries to operate normally, despite the considerable challenges posed by cyber threats and changes in demand patterns. Again, this was published in June of 2020. Take a moment. Despite the considerable challenges posed by cyber threats and changes in demand patterns, electricity held on, proving its resilience to shocks. Moving moving forward, the electricity sector has to embrace the challenge of accelerating its energy transition. The combination of investments in progressive energy infrastructure like in renewables, hydrogen pipelines and electric vehicle charging networks and industrial cluster redevelopment like the electrification of the energy required for chemical production has the potential to support the economy the economic recovery by creating employment and economic activity while increasing the overall resilience of the energy sector in terms of clean energy production. The micro reset will force every company in every industry to experiment new ways of doing business, working, and operating. Those tempted to revert to the old way of doing things will fail. Those that adapt with agility and imagination will eventually turn the COVID-19 crisis to their advantage. Chapter 3, Individual Reset. Hello, Angela. I will take a different approach to reading, keeping in mind that I would like other people to have access to this material, but I will engage from time to time. Page 211, Chapter 3, Individual Reset. Like for macro and micro effects, the pandemic will have profound and diverse consequences for all of us as individuals. For many, for many, for many, it has already been life shattering. To date, COVID-19 has forced a majority of the people the world over to self isolate from families and friends, has thrown into complete disarray personal and professional plans, and has deeply undermined their sense of economic and sometimes psychological and physical security. We have all been reminded of our innate human fragility, our frailties, and our flaws. This realization, combined with the stress engendered by the lockdowns and the concurrent deep sense of uncertainty about what is coming next, could, albeit surreptitiously, change us and the way we relate to other people and to our world. For some, what starts as a change may end up as an individual reset. 3.1. Redefining our humanness. 3.1.1. The better angels in our nature or not. Psychologists point out that the pandemic, like most transformative events, has the ability to bring out the best and the worst in us, angels or devils. What is the evidence so far? Don't care about the metrics. We know the game. And also sometimes if you just refresh. But thank you. I'm going to read that again. Redefining our humanness, the better angels in our nature or not. Psychologists point out that the pandemic, like most transformative events, has the ability to bring out the best and the worst in us, angels or devils. What is the evidence so far? At first glance, it seems the pandemic may have brought people together. In March 2020, images from Italy, the country hit hardest at that time, conveyed the impression that the collective, quote, war effort was one of the only unexpected upsides of the COVID 19 catastrophe that was engulfing the country. As the whole population went into lockdown at home, innumerable examples showed that. As a result, people not only had more time for each other, but also seemed to be kinder to one another. The outlets for this enhanced collective sensitivity range from famous opera singers performing for their neighbors from their balcony to a nightly ritual of the population singing health workers' praises, a phenomenon that extended to almost the whole of Europe. Plus, diverse acts of mutual help and support for those in need. Italy, in a sense, led the way. And since, throughout the period of confinement and throughout the world, there have been comparable, widespread examples of a remarkable personal and social solidarity. Everywhere, simple acts of kindness, generosity, and social solidarity. Everywhere, simple acts of kindness, generosity, and altruism appear to be becoming the norm. In terms of what we value, the notions of cooperation, communitarian ideas, the sacrifice of self interest for the common good, and caring came to the fore. Conversely, manifestations of individual power, popularity, and prestige were frowned upon, even eclipsing the appeal of the quote, rich and famous. That faded as the pandemic progressed. One commentator observed that the coronavirus had the effect of swiftly dismantling, quote, the cult of celebrity, a key feature of our modernity, noting the dream of class mobility dissipates when society locks down. The dream of class mobility dissipates when society locks down. The economy stalls, the death count mounts, and everyone's future is frozen inside their own crowded apartment or palatial mansion. The difference between the two has never been more obvious. Source number 141. A variety of such observations has have prompted not only social commentators, but also the general public itself to ponder whether the pandemic succeeded in bringing the best out of us, and in so doing, triggering a search for higher meaning. Many questions came to mind, like might the pandemic give birth to better selves and to a better world? Will it be followed by a shift of values? Will we become more willing to nurture our human bonds and more intentional about maintaining our social connections? Simply put, we will become more caring. Simply put, will we become more caring and compassionate? If history is any guide, natural disasters like hurricanes and earthquakes bring people together, while pandemics do the opposite. They drive them apart. The reason could be the following: confronted with a sudden, violent, and often brief natural disaster, populations bond together and tend to recover relatively fast. By contrast, pandemics are longer lasting, prolonged events that often elicit ongoing feelings of distrust vis a vis others, rooted in a primal fear of dying. Psychologically, psychologically, the most important consequence of the pandemic is to generate a phenomenal phenomenal amount of uncertainty that often becomes a source of angst. We do not know what tomorrow will bring. Will there be another wave of COVID 19? Will it affect people I love? Will I keep my job? And at such a lack of surety makes us uneasy and troubled. As human beings, we crave certainty, hence the need for, quote, cognitive closure. As human beings, we crave certainty, hence the need for, quote, cognitive closure. Anything that can help erase the uncertainty and ambiguity that paralyze our ability to function, quote, normally. In the context of a pandemic, the risks are complex, difficult to grasp, and largely unknown. Thus, confronted, we are more likely to retrench rather than look to the needs of others, as tends to happen with sudden, natural or not, disasters. And in fact, contrary to the prevailing first impressions conveyed by the media, this in turn, this in turn becomes a profound source of shame, a key sentiment that drives people's attitudes and reactions during pandemics. Shame is a moral emotion that equates with feeling bad, an uncomfortable sentiment that mixes regret, self hate, and a vague sense of quote, dishonor, of not doing the quote, right thing. Shame has been described and analyzed in countless novels and literary texts written about historical outbreaks. It can take forms as radical and horrendous as parents abandoning their children to their fate. At the beginning of the dec- at the beginning of the Decameron, a series of novellas that tell the tale of a group of men and women sheltered in a villa as the Black Death ravaged Florence in 1348. Boccaccio writes that fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children untended, unvisited to their fate. In the same vein, numerous literary accounts of past pandemics, from Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year to Manzoni's The Betrothed, related how so often fear of death ends up overriding all other human emotions. In every situation, individuals are forced to make decisions about saving their own lives that result in profound shame because of the selfishness of their ultimate choice. Thankfully, there are always exceptions, as we saw most poignantly during COVID 19, such as among the nurses and doctors, whose multiple acts of compassion and courage on so many occasions went well beyond the call of their professional duty. But they seem to be just that, exceptions. In The Great Influenza, source number 142, a book that analyzes the Spanish flu's effects on the US at the end of World War I, the historian John Barry recounts that health workers could not find enough volunteers to help. The more virulent the flu became, the less people were willing to volunteer. The collective sense of shame that ensued might be one of the reasons why our general knowledge about the 1918 to 1919 pandemic is so scant, despite the fact that in the US alone, it killed 12 times more people than the war itself. This perhaps also explains why to date so few books or plays have been written about it. Psychologists tell us that psychologists tell us that cognitive closure often calls for black and white thinking and simplistic solutions. Source number 143. A terrain propitious for conspiracy theories and the propagation of rumors, fake news, mistruths. and other pernicious ideas. In such a context, we look for leadership, authority, and clarity, meaning that the question as to whom we trust within our immediate community and among our leaders becomes critical. In consequence, so too does the countervailing issue of whom we distrust. In conditions of stress, the appeal of cohesion and unity increases, which leads us to coalesce around our clan or our group, and to generally become more sociable within it, but not behind it. It seems only natural that our sense of vulnerability and fragility increases, as does our dependence on those around us, as for a baby or a frail person. Our attachment to those close to us strengthens with a renewed sense of appreciation for all those we love, family and friends. But there is a darker side to this. It also triggers a rise in patriotic and nationalistic sentiments, with troubling religious and ethnic considerations also coming into the picture. Take a moment. Take a moment. It also triggers a rise in patriotic and nationalistic sentiments, with troubling religious and ethnic considerations also coming into the picture. In the end, this toxic mix gets the worst of us as a social group. Orhan Pamuk, the Turkish author who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2006, and whose latest novel, Nights of Plague, is due to be published at the end of 2020, recounts how people have always responded to epidemics by spreading rumors and false information. Novel Nights of Plague is due to be published at the end of 2020. Recounts how people have always responded to epidemics by spreading rumors and false information and portraying the disease as foreign and brought in with malicious intent. This attitude leads us to look for a scapegoat. The commonality of all outbreaks throughout history, and is the reason why, quote, unexpected and uncontrollable outbursts of violence, hearsay, panic, and rebellion are common in accounts of plague epidemics from the Renaissance on. Source number 144. Pamuk adds, the history and literature of plagues shows us that the intensity of the suffering, of the fear of death, of the metaphysical dread, and of the sense of the uncanny experienced, and the sense of the uncanny experienced by the stricken populace will also determine the depth of their anger and political discontent. End quote. The CO 19 pandemic has unequivocally shown us all that we live, has shown us all that we live in a world that is interconnected and yet largely, largely bereft of solidarity between nations and often even within nations. Throughout the periods of confinement, remarkable examples of personal solidarity have surfaced, along with counterexamples of selfish behavior. At the global level, the virtue of helping each other has been conspicuous by its absence. This, despite the anthropological evidence that what sets us apart as humans is the ability to cooperate with each other and form, in the process, something bigger and greater than ourselves. Will CO 19 result in people withdrawing into themselves? Or will it nourish their innate sense of empathy and collaboration, encouraging them towards greater solidarity? The examples of previous pandemics are not very encouraging, but this time there is a fundamental difference. We are all collectively aware that without greater collaboration, we will be unable to address the global challenges that we collectively face. Put in the simplest possible terms, if, as human beings, we do not collaborate to confront our existential challenges, the environment and the global governance free fall, among others, we are doomed. Thus, we have no choice but to summon up the better angels of our nature. 3.1.2. Moral choices. The bottom of page 217. The pandemic has forced all of us citizens and policymakers alike, willingly or not, to enter into a philosophical debate. Excuse me. The pandemic has forced all of us citizens and policymakers alike, willingly or not, to enter into a philosophical debate about how to maximize the common good in the least damaging way possible. First and foremost, it prompted us to think more deeply about what the common good really means. Common good is that which benefits society as a whole, but how do we decide collectively what is best for us as a community? Is it about preserving GDP growth and economic activity at any cost to try to prevent unemployment rising? Is it about caring for the most fragile members of our community and making sacrifices for one another? Is it something in between? And if it is, what trade offs are involved? Some schools of philosophical thought, like libertarianism, for which individual freedom matters the most, and utilitarianism, for which the pursuit of the best outcome for the greatest number makes more sense, may even dispute that the common good is a cause worth pursuing. But can conflicts between competing moral theories be resolved? The pandemic brought them to a boil with furious arguments between opposing camps, many decisions framed as cold, quote, and rational, driven exclusively by economic, political, and social considerations, are in fact deeply influenced by moral philosophy. The endeavor to find a theory that is capable of explaining what we should do. Actually, almost every single decision related to how best to deal with the pandemic could be reframed as an ethical choice, reflecting that, in almost all instances, human practices labor under moral considerations. Shall I give to those who have nothing and show empathy to those whose opinions differ from mine? Is it all right to lie to the public for some greater good? Is it acceptable not to help my neighbors who are infected with CO 19? Shall I lay off a number of employees in the hope of keeping my business afloat for the others? Is it okay to escape to my holiday home for my own enhanced safety and comfort? Or should I offer it to someone whose need exceeds mine? Shall I ignore the confinement order to assist a friend or family member? Every single decision, big or small, has an ethical component. And the way in which we respond to all these questions is what eventually enables us to aspire to a better life. Like all notions of moral philosophy, the idea of common good is elusive and contestable. Since the pandemic started, it has provoked furious debates about whether to use a utilitarian calculus when trying to tame the pandemic or to stick to a sacrosanct principle of sanctity of life. Nothing crystallizes the issue of ethical choice more than the debate that raged during the initial lockdowns about the trade off between public health and the hit to growth. As we said earlier, almost all economists have debunked the myth that sacrificing a few lives will save the economy. But irrespective of those experts' judgment, the debate and arguments went on. In the US, in particular, but not exclusively, some policymakers took the line that it was justifiable to value the economy over life, endorsing a policy choice that would have been unimaginable in Asia or Europe, where such pronouncements would have been tantamount to committing political suicide. This realization probably explains UK Prime Minister Johnston's hasty retreat from an initial policy advocating herd immunity, often portrayed by experts and the media as an example of social Darwinism. The prioritization of business over life has a long tradition, running from the merchants of Siena during the Great Plague to those of Hamburg who tried to conceal the cholera outbreak of 1892. However, it seems almost incongruous that it would remain alive today. With all the medical knowledge and scientific data we have at our disposal, the argument put forward by some groups like, quote, Americans for Prosperity is that recessions kill people. This, while undoubtedly true, is a fact that is itself rooted in policy choices informed by ethical considerations. In the US, recessions do indeed kill a lot of people because the absence or limited nature of any social safety net makes them life threatening. How? When people lose their jobs with no state support and no health insurance, they tend to, quote, die of despair through suicides, drug overdoses, and alcoholism, as shown and extensively analyzed by Ann Case and Angus Deaton, source number 145. Economic recessions also provoke deaths outside of the US, but policy choices in terms of health insurance and worker protection can ensure that there are considerably fewer. This is ultimately a moral choice about whether to prioritize the qualities of individualism or those that favor the destiny of the community. It is an individual as well as a collective choice that can be expressed through elections. But the example of the pandemic shows that highly individualistic societies are not very good at expressing solidarity. Source number 146. In the immediate post pandemic era, following the first wave in early 2020, and at a time when many economies around the world are sliding into deep recessions, the perspective of more severe lockdowns seems politically inconceivable. Even the richest countries cannot, quote, afford, they cannot afford to endure a lockdown indefinitely, not even a year or so. The consequences, particularly in terms of unemployment, would be horrific, resulting in a dramatic fallout for society's poorest and individual well being in general. As the economist and philosopher Amartya Sen put it, the presence of disease kills people, and the absence of livelihood also kills people. Source number 147. Therefore, now that testing and contact tracing capacities are widely available, many individual and collective decisions will, of necessity, involve complex cost benefit analyses and even sometimes a quote cruel utilitarian calculus. Every policy decision will become an exceedingly delicate compromise between saving as many lives as possible and permitting the economy to run as fully as possible. Bioethicists and moral philosophers often argue among themselves about counting life years lost or saved rather than just the number of deaths that occurred or that could have been avoided. Peter Singer, a professor of bioethics and author of The Life You Can Save, is a prominent voice among those who adhere to the theory that we should take into account the number of life years lost, not just the number of lives lost. He gives the following example. In Italy, the average age of those dying of COVID-19 is almost 80 years. How do you get averages? How do you get averages? Fuck do you get averages then? June 2020. Sorry. Sorry. He gives the following example. In Italy, the average age of those dying of COVID-19 is almost 80 years, which could prompt us to ask the following questions. How many years of life were lost in Italy? Considering that many of the people who died from the virus were not only elderly, but also had underlying medical conditions. Some economists roughly estimate that Italians lost perhaps an average of 3 years of life, a very different outcome as compared to the 40 or 60 years of life lost when numerous young people perish as a result of the war. Source number 148. The purpose of this example is this. Today, almost everyone the world over has an opinion as to whether the lockdown in her or his country was too severe or not severe enough, whether it should have been shortened or extended, whether it was appropriately put into place or not, whether it was properly enforced or not, often framing the issue as an quote objective fact. In reality, all these judgments and pronouncements that we constantly make are determined by underlying ethical considerations that are eminently personal. Simply put, what we expose as facts or opinions are moral choices that the pandemic has laid bare. They are made in the name of what we think is right or wrong and therefore define us as who we are. Just one simple example to illustrate the point. The WHO and most national health authorities recommend that we wear a mask in public. What has been framed as an epidemiological necessity and an easy risk mitigating measure has turned into a political battlefield in the US and also, but less so, in a few other countries. The decision to wear a mask or not has become politically charged since it is considered as an infringement to personal freedom. But behind the political declaration, refusing to wear a mask in public is a moral choice, as indeed is the decision to wear one. No, it's not. It's not. Okay. I could discuss why, but I'm reading now. Refusing to wear a mask in public is a moral choice, as indeed is the decision to wear one. Does this tell us something about the moral principles that underpin our choices and decisions? Probably yes. The pandemic also compelled us to reconsider the critical importance of fairness, a highly subjective notion yet essential to societal harmony. Taking fairness into consideration reminds us that some of the most basic assumptions we make in economics have a moral element embedded in them. Should, for example, fairness or justice be considered when looking at the laws of supply and demand? And what does the response, bottom of page 222, and what does the response tell us about ourselves? This quintessential moral issue came to the fore during the most acute phase of the pandemic in early 2020, when shortages of some basic necessities like oil and toilet paper and critical supplies for dealing with COVID-19 like masks and ventilators started to occur. What was the right response? Let the laws of supply and demand work their magic so the prices rise high enough and clear the market? Or rather regulate demand or even prices for a little while? In a famous paper written in 1986, Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler, who were subsequently awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics, explored this issue and concluded that rising prices in an emergency is simply unacceptable from a societal standpoint because it will be perceived as unfair. Some economists may argue that higher prices triggered by supply and demand are effective insofar as they discourage panic buying. But most people would consider this an issue that has little to do with economics and more to do with a sentiment of fairness, hence a moral judgment. Most companies understand this. Raising the price of a good that is needed in an extreme situation like a pandemic, particularly if it is a mask or hand sanitizer, is not only offensive but flies in the face of what is considered morally and socially acceptable. For this reason, Amazon prohibited price gouging on its site, and large retail chains responded to the shortages not by raising the price of goods, but by limiting the quantity that each customer could buy. It is hard to tell whether these moral considerations constitute a reset and whether they will have a long lasting post coronavirus effect on our attitudes and behaviors. At the very least, we could assume that we are now more individually aware of the fact that our decisions are infused with values and informed by moral choices. It might follow that if, but it is a big if, in the future we abandon the posture of self interest that pollutes so many of our social interactions, we may be able to pay more attention to issues like inclusivity and fairness. Oscar Wilde had already highlighted this problem in 1892 when depicting a cynic as a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. 3.2. Mental health and well being. For years now, an epidemic of mental health has engulfed much of the world. The pandemic has already made it worse and will continue to do so. Most psychologists, and certainly all those we talk to, seem to concur with the judgment expressed in May 2020 by one of their peers. The pandemic has had a devastating effect on mental health. Source number 149. Unlike physical illness, people with mental health issues have Unlike physical illness, people with mental health issues often have wounds that are invisible to a non professional's naked eye. Yet, in the past decade, mental health Yet, in the past decade, mental health specialists report report an explosion of mental health problems, ranging from depression and suicide to psychosis and addictive disorders. In 2017, an estimated 350 million people around the globe were suffering from depression. At that time, the WHO predicted that depression would become the second main cause of disease burden globally by 2020, and that it would overtake ischemic heart disease as the leading cause of disease burden by 2030. In the US, the CDC estimated in 2017 that depression affected more than 26% of adults. Approximately 1 in 20 report moderate to severe symptoms. At that time, it also predicted that 25% of American adults would suffer from mental illness during the year, and almost 50% would develop at least one mental illness during their lifetime. Source number 150. Similar figures, but maybe not as severe, and trends exist in most countries around the world. In the workplace, the issue of mental health has become one of the big elephants in the corporate room. The epidemic of work-related stress, depression, and anxiety seems to be continuously getting worse. As a revealing example, in 2017 to 2018, in the UK, stress, depression, and anxiety accounted for more than half, 57%, of total working days lost due to ill health. Source number 151. For many people, traversing the COVID-19 pandemic will be defined as living a personal trauma. The scars inflicted may last for years. To start with, in the early months of the outbreak, it was all too easy to fall victim to the biases of availability and salience. Those two mental shortcuts caused us to obsess and ruminate about the pandemic and its dangers. Availability makes us rely on immediate examples that come to mind when evaluating something, and salience predisposes us to focus on things that are more prominent or emotionally striking. Emotionally striking. For months, COVID-19 became almost the only news that was inevitably almost exclusively bad. Relentless reports of deaths, infectious cases, and all the other things that might go wrong, together with emotionally charged images, allowed our collective imaginations to run riot in terms of worry about ourselves and our closest loved ones. Such an alarming atmosphere had disastrous effects on our mental well-being. Furthermore, media amplified anxiety can be very contagious. All this fed into a reality that for so many amounted to personal tragedy, whether defined by the economic impact of income loss and job losses, and or the emotional impact of a domestic violence, acute isolation and loneliness, or the inability to properly grieve for deceased loved ones. Humans are inherently social beings. Companionship and social interactions are a vital component of our humanness. If deprived of them, we find our lives turned upside down. Social relations are, to a significant extent, obliterated by confinement measures and physical or social distancing. And in the case of the COVID-19 lockdowns, this occurred at a time of heightened anxiety when we needed them most. Rituals, rituals that are inherent to our human condition. Handshakes, hugs, kisses, and many others were suppressed. Loneliness and isolation resulted. For now, we know neither whether nor when we might return completely to our old way of life at any stage of the pandemic, but particularly towards the end of lockdowns. Mental discomfort remains a risk. Mental discomfort remains a risk, even after the period of acute stress has passed. Something that psychologists have called the third quarter phenomenon. Source number 152. Third quarter phenomenon. In reference to people who live in isolation for a protracted period of time, like polar explorers or astronauts. They tend to experience problems and tensions towards the end of their mission. Like these people, but on a planetary scale. Our collective sense of mental well being has taken a very severe knock. Having dealt with the first wave, we are now anticipating another that may or may not come. And this toxic emotional mix risks producing a collective state of anguish. The inability to make plans or engage in specific activities that used to be intrinsic parts of our normal life and vital sources of pleasure, like visiting family and friends abroad, planning ahead for the next term at university, applying for a new job, has the potential to leave us confused and demoralized. For many people, the strains and stresses of the immediate dilemmas that follow the end of lockdowns will last for months. It is safe. Is it safe to go on public transport? Is it too risky to go to a favorite restaurant? Is it appropriate to visit this elderly family member or a friend? For a long time to come, these very banal decisions will be tainted with a sense of dread, particularly for those who are vulnerable because of their age or health condition. At the time of writing, June 2020, at the time of writing, June 2020, the impact of the pandemic in terms of mental health cannot be quantified or assessed in a generalized way, but the broad contours are known. In a nutshell, one, individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions like depression will increasingly suffer from anxiety disorders. Two, social distancing measures, even after they've been rolled back, will have worsened mental health issues. Three, in many families, the loss of income consecutive to unemployment will plunge people into the, quote, death of despair phenomenon. Four, domestic violence and abuse, particularly against women and children, will increase as long as the pandemic endures. And five, quote, vulnerable people and children, those in care, the socioeconomically disadvantaged, and the disabled in need of an above average level of support, will be particularly at risk of increased mental distress. Let us review below some of these in greater detail. For many, an explosion of mental health problems occurred during the first months of the pandemic and will continue to progress in the post pandemic era. In March 2020, at the onset of the pandemic, a group of researchers published a study in the Lancet that found that confinement measures produce a range of severe mental health outcomes, such as trauma, confusion, and anger. Source number 153. Although avoiding the most severe mental health issues, a large portion of the world population is bound to have suffered stress to various degrees. First and foremost, it is among those already prone to mental health issues that the challenges inherent in the response to the coronavirus, lockdowns, isolation, anguish, will be exacerbated. Some will weather the storm, but for certain individuals, a diagnostic of depression or anxiety could escalate into an acute clinical episode. There are also significant numbers of people who, for the first time, presented symptoms of serious mood disorder like mania. Going to fucking kill you, you fucking shitbag motherfucker. That was a poem by Oscar Wilde or somebody with a name similar to that. Um, I know too much for you to write this. I digress. It's not hate speech. That was in a song, and I'm pretty sure it's in this book somewhere. Oh, by the way, um, I have the right to free speech. Fair use, not monetized. Um, I'm a man, not a person. I have DNA, not cDNA. Complementary DNA. Thank you very much. Enjoy those. Uh, oh, actually, you won't have any cases to be enjoying. I was going to say enjoy the Supreme Court, but you won't make it there. You have a funner place to go, much more fun place to go. No, don't worry about it. Some will weather the storm, but for certain individuals, a diagnostic of depression or anxiety could escalate into an acute clinical episode. There are also significant numbers of people who, for the first time, presented symptoms of serious mood disorder like mania, signs of depression, and various psychotic experiences. These were all triggered by events directly or indirectly associated with the pandemic and the lockdowns, such as isolation, loneliness, fear of catching the disease, losing a job, bereavement, and concerns about family members and friends. In May 2020, the National Health Service, England's clinical director for mental health, told a parliamentary committee that the demand for, quote, the demand for mental health care would increase significantly once the lockdown ended and would see people needing treatment for trauma for years to come. Source number 154. There is no reason to believe that the situation will be very different elsewhere. Domestic violence has risen during the pandemic. It remains difficult to measure the precise increase because of the high number of cases that remain unreported. But it is nonetheless clear that the rise in incidences was fueled by a combination of anxiety and economic uncertainty. With the lockdowns, all the requisite ingredients for increase in domestic violence coalesced. Isolation from friends, family, and employment, the occasion for constant surveillance by and physical proximity to an abusive partner. Is it me? Is it me, or am I just reading your book? I could be your abusive partner, Klaus. I digress. The occasion for constant surveillance by and physical proximity to an abusive partner, often themselves under more stress and limited or no options for escape. The conditions of lockdown magnified existing abusive behaviors, leaving little or no respite respite for victims and their children outside of the home. Is it all clicking together yet? Outside of their home. Projections from the United Nations Population Fund indicate that if domestic violence increases by 20% during periods of lockdown, there would be an additional 15 million cases of intimate partner violence in 2020. For an average lockdown duration of 3 months, 31 million cases for an average lockdown of 6 months, 45 million for an average lockdown of 9 months, and 61 million if the average lockdown period were to last 1 year. Is it coming together now? These are global projections inclusive of all 193 UN member states and represent the high levels of underreporting characteristic of gender-based violence. All told, all told, they total an additional 15 million cases of gender-based violence for every 3 months of lockdown continues. All lockdown continues. Source number 155. It is hard to predict how domestic violence will evolve in the post pandemic era. Conditions of hardship will make it more likely, but much will depend on how individual countries control the two pathways through with which domestic violence occurs. One, the reduction in prevention and protection efforts, social services, and care. And two, the concomitant increase in the incidence of violence. This subchapter concludes with a point that may seem anecdotal, but that has gained some relevance in an era of relentless online meetings that could expand in the foreseeable future. Are video conversations and mental well being bedfellows? During the lockdowns, video conversations were for many a personal and professional lifesaver, allowing us to maintain human connections, long distance relationships, and connections with our colleagues. But they have also generated a phenomenon of mental exhaustion, popularized as Zoom fatigue, a condition that applies to the use of any video interface. During the lockdown, screens and videos were so widely solicited for communication purposes that this equated to a new social experiment conducted at scale. The conclusion? Our brains find it difficult and sometimes unsettling to conduct virtual interactions, especially if and when such interactions account for the quasi totality of our professional and personal exchanges. We are social animals for whom the many minor and often nonverbal cues that normally occur during physical social interactions are vital in terms of communication and mutual understanding. When we talk to someone in the flesh, we don't only concentrate on the words they are saying, but also focus on a multitude of infra-language, infra-language signals that help us make sense of the exchange we are having. Don't go there. Is the lower body of a person facing us or turned away? What are their hands doing? What's the tone of their general body language? How is the person breathing? A video conversation makes the interpretation of these nonverbal cues charged with subtle meaning impossible, and it forces us to concentrate exclusively on words and facial expressions, sometimes altered by the quality of the video. On a virtual conversation, we have nothing other than intense, prolonged eye contact, which can easily become intimidating or even threatening, particularly when a hierarchical relationship exists. This problem is magnified by the gallery view, when the central vision of our brains risks being challenged by the sheer number of people on view. This is a threshold beyond which we cannot decode so many people at once. Psychologists have a word for this: continuous partial attention. It is as if our brain were trying to multitask. In vain, of course. At the end of the call, the constant search for nonverbal cues that cannot be found simply overwhelms our brain. We get the feeling of being drained of energy and left with a sense of profound dissatisfaction. This, in turn, negatively affects our sense of mental well being. The impact of COVID-19 has given rise to a wider and deeper array of mental health problems affecting greater numbers of the population, many of whom might have been spared in the immediate future had it not been for the pandemic. Viewed in these terms, the coronavirus has reinforced, not reset, mental health issues. It has reinforced, not, not, not reset mental health issues. However, what the pandemic has achieved with respect to mental health, as in so many other domains, is the acceleration of pre-existing trend. With this has come heightened public awareness of the severity of the problem. Mental health, the most significant single factor affecting people's level of satisfaction with their lives, source number 156, was already on the radar screen of policymakers. In the post-pandemic era, these issues may now be given the priority they deserve. This indeed constitutes a vital reset. I'm going to go through chat. I'm going to be done reading this. We'll go into another segment maybe later tonight, maybe tomorrow, maybe 4 a.m., who knows. We're leaving off at page 232, and the title of that is Changing Priorities. I'm just going to scrub through chat real quick. A lot of retractions here. I know why. Damn it, I missed it. Okay. East Paddington. Oh. It's like, what? Hardware store? I get it. Doggy boy. Doggies. Hello, people. People are feeling good. Are you feeling good? We are watching theater. I know, I would not want to read this if I didn't do it like that. It's just like, why would I read this? It's uh, it brings your mind, like, as I'm reading, it brings my mind into all the things that you studied, and it's hard to read because you're like, oh my god, this is a constellation, but I have to read. This is a constellation. Oh my god, this is a constellation, but I have to read. Oh my god, this is a constellation, but I have to read. Oh my god, where am I? He reads with emotion. Oh, be careful. Don't stand next to me when I read. Apparently, nowadays. He sure does. Yeah, kid by the side of the road. Ron O'Javins. Who's Ron O'Javen? Is that a real name? Oh yeah. I was. Yeah, it's this book. This is the. Mm, it's 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 the war manual in no uncertain terms. Okay. Thank you for helping each other. Okay, excellent. Thanks for tuning in. Whoever's here or whoever left, it doesn't matter. I appreciate you even being here at all. And I'm gonna go take a break and see who else is doing stuff. Okay, go save the planet.